Hey, what's up? In this video, I will go over how I created this shot in Blender using Eevee. So there's a lot going on and I will go over the main things. I won't be going in depth about how I made every single item. However, the main things like the bokeh and the lighting I've already covered in previous tutorials, so make sure you check those out in the description below. Alright, so let me enable the overlays. You can see there's a lot going on. So let's do a little breakdown. Now the lights are chaotic, they're all over the place. There's a rig, there's a car. So the main takeaway from this video was to create a scene that could be put in a movie or whatever that was made entirely out of free Sketchfab models. So I actually used the Sketchfab add-on to quickly import models inside of Blender. And that goes everything from the protagonist right here down to the buildings in the back, this nice vehicle over here. So I didn't model any of this stuff, except for maybe like, you know, the floor, which is just a plane. Character initially looked like this. This is my own rig that I made that I decided to use on this character, which worked great in the end. The weight painting wasn't a big issue and, you know, the rig just worked, so that was nice. It's nice when things work by just plugging it. I feel like that's never the case. So if I put it on this matte cap, set it to random, you can see all the separate objects here. So I did add a bunch of road cracks to break up the road over here. A bunch of, you know, lights, and this right here is an emitter. Yes, I did follow the Ian Hubert moth tutorial. In the close-up that I used, you can't really see the moths, but I made 3 other shots that I didn't get to render in time to make this tutorial. But personally, I feel like I picked, you know, a rather close-up, but there's all these other shots that I made. But this is the one I went for. But I feel like my favorite one has got to be this one, because it's nice and there's a lot of stuff going on. So the workflow here was, what do I have in mind? So your idea, that's number 1. Then position your first asset, or, you know, like character. So I started with the floor and then the character, which you just look like this before. And then I positioned a camera. Right, so for now we'll go with this camera right here. I positioned my camera, then I made a window like this where I have my camera view, and in here I can work on the assets, and I could start adding cities and buildings, lights and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, once the assets were there, I decided to rig up the character, put him in a cool position. This mailbox wasn't here initially, but I needed the character to lean onto something. So I quickly downloaded this from Sketchfab, and I needed his leg to lean on it. But I really like this model, and I didn't want to like make a weird duplicate of it beneath it and make it look like something that doesn't make any sense. So instead I just bent one of its legs, like, you know, like somebody kicked it and dented it. And, you know, now my character has something to lean on. So the animation was done using a combination of setting keyframes as well as using drivers. So it's not perfect, but yeah, I feel like it does the job pretty well. For instance, you can tell his feet are twitching, you know, just moving around like he can't sit still because of an overload of caffeine or some kind of disease. Never mind. Same goes for his knee. I believe his clavicles as well. Yeah, and then like the poles of his arms and knees, because if I move this, it will move the direction of the knee. So the way I did that was you just set a keyframe and you go into graph editor. You can grab one of the axes. So I did it at one of the axes, not the whole thing. And for instance, the X location for position. And I added a noise modifier and basically set the scale and the strength, and that's it. And then it will animate on. And then I had the idea to add a cigarette. So I downloaded the cigarette again from Sketchfab and attached a point light to it to emulate the emission, right, from the tip of the cigarette. And also, like in the materials, what I did was I grabbed the intensity of my light. So if you right click on a value, you can copy it as a new driver. So that's what I did, and then went into the materials of my cigarette. And this one already had a emissive mask, so that's very nice. It was already plugged in, so all I had to do was turn up the emissive strength. So instead I pasted the driver from my point light into the emission strength, and if you go to edit driver, I set it to scripted expression so that I could, I could say energy, which is the name of the point light. Doesn't really matter what the name is. You could change it here and then make sure you update it here. I did the value of my point light's, brightness times 2500, because this is such a small object, but I really needed it to glow on camera. And in the final render, it still wasn't bright enough, but I'll show that later on. And the cool part was now I only needed to animate my point light, and it will automatically update the emission on the cigarette as well. And if I render this out, I can, you see, so it will affect the environment because there's an actual light in the scene. One more thing I added to the model was, first of all, he was smiling. He looked too happy for the scene. I wanted him to look normal without any expression, so I fixed his face. And then when he smokes a cigarette, when he puts it into his mouth, we can't really see the front of his face, so luckily we cannot see this horrific result over here, but he actually does open his mouth. And from the view of the camera, you can see the movement of him opening his mouth, which is nice. So for that, I added a shape key that can open and close his mouth like that. All right, so finally I put everything together, and character was smoking a cigarette, looking around, and I went back into the, to take another puff. Last but not least, the camera. So you notice this very nice camera movement, which looks, you could animate this, but this looks very natural because it was. So I used my phone to actually record the movement. And there's a bunch of ways you can do this. You could record like a bunch of tracking dots on your wall, track that in Blender and use that for your camera. But I use an add-on that allows me to control my cameras using my iPhone. Now, for the setup, before I rendered this out, I made sure I had the right settings. So we're obviously rendering in Eevee over here. I did set the samples to 150 because right now what we see here is the the regular bokeh that you would get in Blender, but as soon as I crank this up, we're gonna get that realistic bokeh effect that I've covered in one of my videos. But I noticed if you enable the jitter camera to get this bokeh and you have motion blur turned on, you either have to turn your samples up way high, or you turn off motion blur altogether, and you can do well with 100 or 150 samples. So that's what I did because the render times were kind of ridiculous. So then my render passes, I actually rendered a bunch of passes. Some of these were unnecessary, like the diffuse light and specular and color. but the mist pass was definitely a good one. The emission pass and the bloom pass, and then obviously the crypto mats are also very important, and I'll show you that right now in the compositing tab. So once you render out one frame, you can actually go into the compositor and see it. So here's my frame when it's rendered out. So here we can see that realistic bokeh I was talking about, and you see how diverse the bokeh actually looks as we go further towards the edges. And yeah, there's nice haze and all that. So my render layers look kind of ridiculous right now, but that's because I enabled all this stuff here earlier, all the passes. So the way I render out each shot is with its own passes, because obviously you want as much information out of each shot when you're rendering it anyway. Because, you know, when you're going to composite it later on or add visual effects or stuff, it will just make life much easier. So in this case, I added a file output node, added a whole bunch of inputs here. And if I, you know, toggle through these, you can see my mist pass. It's more so for the background than the character. These are useless. My emission layer, so it's for the cigarette and the vehicles and lights in the background. Ambient occlusion. The bloom, also a very useful one. And then my crypto objects. So I made a bunch of these. So you can actually, if you have a crypto object and you add a crypto mat node, it allows you to pick from the image itself. I can click my character, and then if I toggle through this, you can see it will create a mat for my character. Plugged it into this file output node, set a directory, PNG, and all that stuff. And then you render it out, and I will composite this in After Effects. Now you can choose your editing software of choice. You could composite it in Nuke or DaVinci Resolve. But I like After Effects because I'm used to it. So let's jump into After Effects. All right, here we are in Adobe After Effects. So this won't be an After Effects tutorial, but I will show you basic stuff that I did in order to, you know, create my final image. So here's the footage when I load it in. You know, pretty nice shot. Nice bokeh, looks lovely. The way it also fades in and out as, you know, the lights go behind an object. It's very realistic. And of course the character itself, the lights doing their stuff, the grime on the lens. Yeah, very nice. So let's enhance this shot, because, you know, you could use this shot as it is, but it can always be better. And in this case, there's quite a few things that could make it better. First of all, the smoke. So there's no smoke coming from the cigarette nor from the character's mouth. So in After Effects, there's a third-party plugin called Trapcode Particular. And if I enable that, you can see this nice cigarette smoke, which actually follows the cigarette. And then there's one for the character blowing the smoke. If I just preview this. You know, the character blowing the smoke, it might not look like the best effect, honestly, but, you know, whatever does the job and makes it look believable. Then I use this other plugin from Video Copilot called Optical Flares. And this will add very nice lens flares to your shot. So what I did in this case was I used the bloom pass as my input for the lens flares. Then I also added another lens flare for the cigarette. So notice how earlier I mentioned that the tip of the cigarette wasn't bright enough for the shot. So I did the exact same thing. Added a lens flare for the cigarette. So that's for all the visual effects on that part. Now let's get to the post-processing. So I added 3 effects here. One for the color grading. So I went for using very cold colors. Honestly, this is preference, I'd say. Depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. I thought this shot looked very old and sad. So that's what I went for. Then I added a tint effect to take away just a little bit of color. You can barely tell, but it takes away a little bit of that color away. And then added a tiny bit of sharpening. And finally I added my vignette to set the focus on the character. And I topped it off with some film grain. And yeah, there's the final shot. You know, this guy reminds me of Agent 47 from the Hitman games, right? This is like Hitman being retired and he started smoking and he's on his way to kill his next target. So there you go. That was my breakdown of this shot that I made right inside of Blender using Eevee with some additional compositing in Adobe After Effects. If you like this type of video and want to see more from me, hit that like button and subscribe, because I will upload every week on Saturday. In the description you can find my social handles, so make sure you check that one out as well. All right, see you in the next one.